Christians don't believe in going to heaven. That's a lie perpetrated by Big Hollywood. But what do we believe? A lot of people think Christianity is a religion about how to get the good ending after you die. And yes, maybe God is nice and throws you a muffin once in a while during your life, but it's really about earning your way into heaven when you finally kick that bucket. And probably this image comes from watching too many cartoons, or the wrong kind. I'm Scandinavian, all we watch is the Moomins, which coincidentally is the reason Finland is the only other country in the Nordics I respect, alongside Norway and Iceland of course. But this is a terrible representation of what Christians believe. I mean, we're talking History Channel documentary level of misinformation here, except with less aliens. Let's start by going through how Christian thoughts about the afterlife develops, beginning in the Old Testament. Now, among ancient religions, Israelites were pretty weird, because they did not like death. But oh, you say, I don't like death either. What's so strange about that? Well, you, my good sir, or sirette, I don't judge, you can be a woman too, have probably grown up in a very westernized culture which has been influenced by Christianity and the hope for something more after life. But many religions like Platonism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Hellenism, and Egyptianism don't see death as necessarily a bad thing. At worst, it's a normal part of life that you just have to accept, like in Greek mythology, where you go to Hades to be depressed for the rest of your existence. And at best, your soul will be set free into eternal bliss like Buddhism and Platonism. Or you'll turn into a cool new animal like a Labrador retriever who loves eating but hates chewing, like in Hinduism. In few religions was death seen as it was in ancient Israelite religion, as an unnatural intrusion into the normal order of things. God created matter and the physical world, and intended for us to live in it with him, as we see in the Genesis narrative. And this is a reason why the Old and New Testament don't speak a lot about an afterlife, because we already have the ideal goal that everyone should look forward to in the very first chapters of the Bible, and in Eden, humans would have lived forever without the need for an afterlife. So, this is the background to death in the Old Testament, but let's get into how it speaks about the matter directly. The first way the writers speak about death is with a lot of doom and gloom. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise? And, for the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Sheol, the pit, the grave, and so on are all terms used by the Old Testament to speak of where people go after they die. And at first glance, you could be forgiven for thinking that the Israelites essentially had a Homeric Hades view of death, where you go into some sort of state of being asleep or just generally devoid of all the pleasures of being alive, because Sheol is never described as being nice. But of course, dying would not have been spoken of as so bad unless people had a hope for something else, and we see this hope in places like Psalm 23, where David states that he will dwell in the house of God forever, or when the patriarchs or David dies, and we are told that they went to be with their kin. So, even though death is this terrible evil that really shouldn't exist, there exists a wish or a hope that God will right this wrong as well. And lastly, and almost most importantly, there are events such as when Saul summons the ghost of the dead prophet Samuel up from Sheol, which is definitely not recommended by the way, or when Elijah, who is both too scared and too cool to die the normal way, gets taken up into heaven on chariots of fire. So, putting what the Old Testament believes about death together, we get, first, the sense that it's unnatural, second, the hope that it's not the end, and third, definite indications that it's not the end. After all, where did Elijah go, and why does it say he's coming back? The Old Testament officially closes about 400 years before Jesus Christ was born. And in this time, the Israelites sometimes had enough spare time between being conquered and rebelling to do some thinking, especially as they come into more and more contact and intermingling with other cultures. So, while before the great worry of the Israelites had mostly focused on survival of their people and their nation, and don't get me wrong, this continued, now more people started wondering about that great thing that we are talking about today, death. And it would be wrong to say that anything resembling a unified vision took hold amongst the Jews in this time. Our most famous examples are Philo, the Alexandrian Greece fanboy who basically took a bunch of Greek philosophy and tried to make it work with Judaism, so he essentially believed what Plato did. And from the New Testament era we know the Sadducees, who denied any form of afterlife at all. A lot of this though was probably because people who believe in an afterlife tend to be a lot less scared of dying in an armed rebellion, and the Sadducees had really cushied up to Caesar, and they also lost this cushioning up when the Jews rebelled, so they were actually warranted in this. But another strain of thought developed that would be the one held by the Pharisees and later even the rabbis. Those who held to this view looked back on passages that probably referred to God restoring Israel from exile, but that spoke in a very suspicious language like, "After 2 days he will revive us, and on the 3rd day he will raise us up." And "Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy." And the translators of the Septuagint, the first Greek Old Testament, translate passages like, "If a man dies, shall he live again?" into, "If a man dies, he shall live." So in this time, some Israelites connected the dots with the earlier belief that death could not have the final say in our relationship with God and the goodness of the physical world, and reasoned that this means that death itself will be undone, and the dead will be raised and literally walk out of their graves, or something like that. This is what gives us passages in intertestamental writings like in Maccabees, for if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. And of course there are even more obvious passages like in Daniel chapter 12, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt," but the dating of that one is controversial. So the next step in the Christian understanding about life and death was a radical one, that all who died would live again, and this is what brings us to the New Testament. Now, if there are two groups you do not expect to get along, it's the Christians and the Pharisees. But when it comes to people walking out of their graves, except in one case, they both agreed. So, as we have seen, the Pharisees were the main political party that held to the view of the resurrection, unlike the Sadducees, who thought it was dangerous, and the Essenes, who probably believed it but kinda just wanted to be left alone. St. Paul even uses this belief, which was accepted wholesale by Christians, to cause a fight in the Sanhedrin between the Pharisees and Sadducees, which I think is hilarious. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So this sin shows us where all the talk about going to heaven if we believe in the resurrection comes from. The interesting here is of course angel or spirit, which was likely the way Pharisees spoke of the state men were in between the current life and the future resurrection. Just as Paul himself says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And this finally lands us at the complete view of what's going to happen to us after death. First we die, then we wait, then we live. But of course there is one thing that differentiates the Christian hope of resurrection from the rabbinic one. We hold that the first man has already been resurrected. And of course that is Jesus Christ, who rose on Easter morning in AD 33. And the New Testament uses this resurrection as both proof and assurance that we shall also be raised, as well as a paradigm for not just our bodies and lives, but for all creation. Because you see, Jesus didn't just rise with the same old body, it was the same but better. Because while people like Lazarus, who were also raised from the dead, died again, the new body of Jesus Christ is glorified and cannot die. And our future resurrection, which will happen at this baller thing called the Second Coming or Judgment Day, which, yeah, that is probably exactly what you think it's gonna be, it will be a partaking in Jesus' resurrection, meaning that we will also be transformed. And no, this doesn't mean that we look like C-3PO, but that our current bodies will have the stain of sin removed, so to speak. So we won't die anymore, and we won't have the impulse to do a bunch of stupid stuff. And it's not just we who will be transformed, but the entire world. The paradigm for what the world after the resurrection will be like is Genesis, where God dwells with man and man subjugates the world and builds paradise. And this hope is first mentioned clearly in Isaiah with the new heavens and new earth, but like any good book, the Bible ties the ending to the beginning. And Revelation ends with a scene of the old world passing away and the new world taking its place, where there is no evil and God wipes away all our tears. And then, by a flowing river, is the tree of life, which man was supposed to eat of in the Garden of Eden, now available for all. So we're not going to be sitting on a cloud playing harp for all eternity, which is the point that this video's been leading up to. We will be in a very physical world that is very similar to the one you are sitting in right now. There will be beautiful nature, a sky full of stars, you'll have all the friends in the world and all the time alone in the world. You will have rest, and I have a feeling that everything will feel ridiculously normal. And most importantly of all, God will no longer be distant, but He will be near to us whenever we are in need. And so please choose life and join me in eternity here on earth. Amen. Thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe. I have more video ideas than I have brain cells. I hope to get around to some church history eventually, so I get to make fun of people like Arius. But thank you for watching, and may God's peace be with you. Amen.